Okay, so just want to say welcome to everyone here to the October CTS Spotlight. This is actually the first Spotlight that I've been a part of, so I'm really excited. And I'm really excited to hear from Jeanine Johnston, who's our presenter with the Stanley Park Ecology Society. And so I'll just say a few words about myself and the series, and then we'll get started. So my name is Erin, and I recently started working with CTS as a project coordinator. And yeah, I've been really enjoying getting to know like the different CTS programs, and one of those programs is the Spotlight Series, which started during the COVID-19 pandemic, sort of as a way of, I think, connecting the CTS community online, like many other organizations. But I think it's also continued because it's a really cool way of getting connected to other organizations and sort of getting that opportunity to sort of get a close up into the projects and the work, and just to hear about the really cool things that are going on in Vancouver and how we can be involved. So we're going to be hearing from Jeanine Johnston about stewardship opportunities and projects with Stanley Park. And I'll let her introduce herself in just a moment, but I'll say a couple tech-related things. First is that Rafa is going to be our tech person, so if you have any tech issues, just message him. The second is that we are recording this, so just to be aware, of course, it's totally up to you if you want your camera on or off. And the last one is that the chat box is down at the bottom, and feel free to sort of write any questions or anything that you want directed towards Jeanine, and we'll take sort of moments throughout the presentation to pause and answer any questions that you have. So without further ado, I will pass it off to Jeanine.
Thank you very much. I'm really excited to be here doing this presentation, and Rafa and I ran into each other a little while ago on another Zoom call, and sort of realized that I think it was a Canada-wide Zoom call, and we realized that we were in the same region, and thought, hey, well, maybe we can actually work together. So this is a culmination of that, which is exciting to see. So I'm excited to be on here talking a little bit about stewardship programming in Stanley Park. So my name is Jeanine Johnston. I'm the stewardship coordinator with the Stanley Park Ecology Society. I've been with the society now for, I think I'm starting my 4th year there, and I've been working as stewardship coordinator now for starting on my 3rd year as stewardship coordinator. Previously, I was working as an environmental educator there. And so Stanley Park Ecology Society is a nonprofit organization, and we work in education, conservation, doing research, as well as habitat restoration work in Stanley Park. And our goal is to learn about what's going on in the park and actually find ways to try and help the ecosystems and keep them healthy. And so a lot of the work that I do is teaching kids and adults and all kinds of different people about all the different habitat restoration work that we can do in Stanley Park. And I want to take this moment to acknowledge that in Stanley Park, when we're doing this work, we are on the unceded land of the Musqueam, the Squamish Nation, and the Tsleil-Waututh Nations. And something that I always try and keep in mind when we're doing our restoration work is that we aim to do our restoration without harm. And so the intent is to better the environment and not cause issues. But we always have to recognize that when we're doing stewardship work, we're always changing the land. And so we work as much as we can to understand that and work with the nations too, so that we can make sure that we're not doing harm as much as possible. Yeah. Okay, so just so you know, I've got some notes in front of me and I've got a presentation on my right-hand side. So if I'm looking around a little bit, I'm not fully distracted. I'm just looking at a few other things. Yeah, so I'm going to be getting into my presentation in just a moment. I'm going to be sharing some slides on the right in just a second, but I wanted to invite everyone throughout the presentation to put your comments or questions into the chat box, and Erin will be monitoring that. So if you have any questions, particularly ones that come up as you're listening, please feel free to put them in, and I'm more than happy to stop and address them. I'm going to be starting off with some information about the programs that I run and that we do in Stanley Park. And then we'll be going into doing some plant identification. So I've got some comparative identification that I would like to do for some rubus species. That includes Himalayan blackberry and a few other native species as well. And then I wanted to go really briefly into talking about some knotweed and hogweed species, mostly just to kind of let you know about them. And then I'll have some resources that you can take a look at. And so we'll make sure that the information that I'm going to be talking to you about today and the slides that I'm going to be showing you today are going to be available later on. So the intent is for these to be useful for you in the future. Okay. And I'll have some time at the end. So if you've got some questions that come up throughout the time and you didn't get to put it into the chat in time, then I'd like to have an open question session. And given the size of the group at the end, we may be able to just have it sort of everyone with their microphones off at the end, just to have a little chat conversation time. But during the presentation, I'll get you to keep your microphones muted as you are right now, which is perfect. And if you do have a question that Erin brings up, then feel free to unmute yourself so we can chat a little bit about the question. Okay, I'm going to share my screen, so bear with me for a second. Okay, is everyone seeing a screen with an acknowledgement on it right now? Perfect, awesome. Okay. So this is the acknowledgement that I gave before, and I like to put it up on my screen just so I make sure that I actually remember to talk about it as well. Okay. Okay, so one of the programs that I run in Stanley Park, along with a number of volunteers, is Eco Stewards. And this is a weekend program that we run for community stewardship volunteers who want to come out and do invasive removal, as well as some in planting, which we've had the opportunity to do a little bit of this year. Because of COVID, we've actually been able to do planting that we wouldn't have otherwise been able to do with a number of different groups. Typically, we can only do planting with groups that have a lot of money to pay for big planting events, but this year our setup is a little bit different, and so we're able to offer this for our community groups too, which is really fun. Yeah, we also do a weekday program, which is our CERT program, which is the Special Invasives Removal Team. And so this crew comes out and does invasive removal throughout the park, and all of our stewardship programs go all year long. It's pretty rare that we need to cancel, but when we do, it's usually because we've got too much wind, or as we were talking about at the beginning with Vancouver not dealing with snow very well, sometimes snow will shut us down for a day. But the CERT crew comes out all the time. They're an amazing group of people. You can see in these photos here, this is removal of yellow flag iris, which is an invasive plant in Stanley Park and throughout this region. And this summer, we had a number of volunteers that continued to come out who were able to make it out to the park without, while being safe during COVID. And you can see some of the piles that they removed. So on the left-hand side, you can see one of those piles. And I would estimate off the top of my head that they removed probably about 40 piles that size. It was an enormous undertaking, and I didn't even think that they were going to get that much done. And they really did quite an amazing job this summer. So it was very exciting, particularly since we thought we weren't going to get anything done. Now, one of the other projects that we get to do in Stanley Park, which we've done with a group called Earth Hand Gleaners with Sharon Callis, is restoration weaving. And so this is a project that I've been really fascinated by. And this is where we actually get to do weaving using invasive plants. And using it within the environment. So on the left-hand side here, you can see someone weaving a basket out of English ivy. And so this is where these baskets were actually used on a site to help build a little bit of space for birds to come and perch on. This was an area where there was quite a bit of blackberry that we had taken out, and so it was quite bare. And so this allowed us to have a little bit more vertical space for birds to perch on and move through the site. In the end, it ended up not being needed quite as much because it filled in with native plants really quickly at this site. But either way, it was an amazing project to get to do. And I want to show you a few photos from one of the sites that we worked on. So you can see on the right-hand side here, this is an image of a site on Lost Lagoon that we worked on with our Eco Stewards group. And the site that you're looking at there previously was blackberry as far as you could see. So if you can, from the point of view of this photo, you previously would not have been able to see the water at all. And so the blackberry was completely blocking that out. And when we've got blackberry in a site, it does provide some habitat for birds and other species, but it doesn't provide very good habitat. So our goal really is to bring in better habitat by removing the blackberry, but also replanting and rebuilding the native plants within the area. And these are some photos of how we did that rebuilding of those native plants. And you can see the fences that were woven in. So these are actually woven in with a native species called red osier dogwood. And the way that this was done was the dogwood was actually cut, and so they were individual sticks essentially of dogwood that were then driven into the ground and then woven into these fences, as well as the other structures you can see on that middle image. And then over time, if you can potentially see in that middle image, there's some of the twigs that are coming up are bright red, and they've got little green shoots on them, and they actually grew, and they've grown into these enormous plants, and they've taken over the area in the best way possible and created awesome habitat. And so that was from a weaving project, and so it had sort of a twofold benefit in that it created habitat, but it also reduced the number of people walking through the area just by having the fence up. And it was amazing. We had one side that we did put a fence up on, and the other side we didn't. And the difference in how quickly the plants grew up and on the side with the fence was huge. It took much less time for the plants to grow. I think I've got one more photo of this is what it looked like early summer 2020. And I'm going to go back to that previous photo on the right hand side. You can see how bare it was, and then that is how much it's filled in that area. So that's some of the work that we get to do in Stanley Park. And one of the beautiful things about this site is we actually were getting comments from people who visit the Lost Lagoon area and maybe have visited the Lost Lagoon area for the last 20 years, and had said that they previously had seen a number of different bird species, and then they were seeing less and less as the blackberry took over. And this past summer, there was one bird species that we haven't seen in this area, using the area for at least 6 years. The red-winged blackbirds came back in, and there was evidence that they were actually nesting within this area, which was one of the most exciting things. And we've seen otters, river otters using this space. Beavers have been coming back in to use the space as well. And we've got a number of families of very confident raccoons that come through the space and try and convince people to give them their lunch. And they're also very convincing. One of the other projects that we do as well to make sure that we've got an understanding of where the invasive plants are and which invasive plants we have in Stanley Park is mapping. And so we've got a number of mapping teams that come out and go throughout the park. And one of the species that we actually found with our mapping program on the right-hand side, you can see, is Italian arum. And so this is a plant that we didn't actually know was invasive, but we had a really skilled mapper out who spotted it, and it was in the middle of winter, and there was this beautiful tropical looking plant like this growing out of the snow in this open field area. And she thought, there's no way that this is a native plant in the way that it looks. And so she did some research and found out that in Washington state, so just south of the border from us in the States, this plant is considered invasive, and our habitat is close enough to their habitat in Washington that we can consider it invasive up here too. And so this is a plant that actually quite often has been and maybe still is put in as an ornamental plant in gardens. And so we did some research with the park board and found out that the site that we'd found it in was actually a former garden bed, which was a little bit of a relief, just for the fact that it wasn't sort of growing up on its own. It had a spot that it previously had been in. If it hadn't been a garden bed, then we might be concerned that it was moving from other areas of the park. So that would have been a different concern. So that was a very, very interesting find on that one. Okay, so I wanted to put up a few resources here. Now, as I say, don't feel that you need to copy these down or anything like that, but we'll make sure that these are available for you afterwards. But in terms of doing plant identification, whether this is as part of a program you're doing or if it's something that you're just interested in, want to do in your backyard, iNaturalist is one of my favorite apps to use. It's a really great space where you can put information on the app and actually learn a bit about what it is that you're finding, and then people in the community can help you identify it. And so it's you don't just put it up there, someone will actually come on and figure out whether or not they agree with your identification. So I quite like that one. And then I'm not going to go through all of the other ones here, but these ones are all really good resources for this region particularly. Okay. So this is the part where I'm going to get into some identification of blackberry species. Now, since we've got a pretty small group here, I was thinking, I'm wondering if anybody here in particular has ever done invasive removal, and if you've ever done blackberry removal before. I'm seeing some nodding heads. I think, yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, so in blackberry is Himalayan blackberry is an invasive species in this region. But we've got a number of other rubus species, which is the sort of the general type of plant that this one is. And they can be really hard to identify one from another. And so I'm going to go through some general information about each species, and then I want to go through some more detailed information about how to compare one to another. Because I find I can learn as much as I want about one species, but unless I can compare it to the other things that I'm seeing, I usually can't really identify it. And so this is an opportunity, if you've run into these species before, then you may very well be able to think about how these different species look in your mind. But if you're going out again later on, the intent is to have this as a resource for you so you can have it afterwards. So if you want to go out and apply this knowledge later on and let me know if you find this useful for identifying blackberry and other rubus species. So we're going to go through Himalayan blackberry, cutleaf blackberry, which is another invasive species out here, salmonberry, which is a native species, thimbleberry, which is another native species, as well as trailing blackberry. So we do have a native blackberry in British Columbia, and we're going to talk a little bit about how to identify it. Okay. So Himalayan blackberry, I've got a lot of content on this slide, so don't be too intimidated. I'm going to talk through most of it. So in general, when we're looking at identifying Himalayan blackberry, we can look at the flowers, but the flowers we're going to see as we go through can be quite similar between different species. So often they're going to be small and they'll be white to pink in color. So sometimes they do actually look pink, which they're very pretty. And they've got 5 petals. The stalks, so the stems, are prickly, and the prickles themselves can be straight or hooked. They've got ridged stems, and I've got some photos later on that'll explain what that means, the ridged stems, because that can be a little bit of a confusing term. And they can grow 3 meters in height. So it's really, they can grow quite tall. In Stanley Park, we found some spots where it's growing 10 meters or 10 feet tall. And we'll have it growing right up into trees, and it'll actually even use the trees to get taller and taller. So it's quite impressive, terrifying, but impressive. And it can also grow 12 meters or so in length. And so when blackberry grows, it puts up leader canes that kind of come up and then they go back down. And when they come back down to the ground, they can actually reroot. And so if I were to put a camera on some blackberry, some Himalayan blackberry, and left it there for a long time for a time lapse, you might actually think that it looks like it's crawling. So it's putting out these leader canes that are then going down to the ground, they're growing, and they're going to grow into more of a bush again, and then continue doing that. So blackberry can really, it almost walks as it goes. It's when you look at it, if you look at a blackberry bush, or what we call a berm, in one year and then come back the following year, you'll probably see these leader canes sticking out, trying to find new ground. The leaves themselves tend to be pretty round. They're quite large, and they're going to have, most often, 5 leaves. This can also be a tough one though, because when the blackberry is really young, sometimes it doesn't form all the leaves properly, so it might not look like it's got 5 leaves. And then the other piece that makes it extra confusing is if the cane has berries on it, then they actually only have 3 leaves. So this is where the comparative identification, once we go in a little deeper, is going to help you to identify it based on a few other pieces. Because of course, with biology, there's always an exception, and which just makes everything so much more confusing. So this is an attempt to make that less confusing. Most often, blackberry will grow in disturbed soil. So anywhere that the soil has been disturbed, that could be by people, maybe building something, removing plants, it's pretty good chance that blackberry is going to find a way in, or another invasive species. And so anytime we do restoration and do removal of some kind, we always want to go in and make sure that we're monitoring the sites that we do removal in, because the disturbed sites really attract a lot of invasive plants. And one of the things that's, whoops, I've gone the wrong direction. One of the things that's sort of surprising with blackberries, it can actually be tolerant to flooding. And so it can handle quite a bit of flooding, and in some cases we'll see it really take root even in water. Not to an enormous degree, but it'll put down leader canes into the water sometimes and actually reroot, which is a little bit mind-blowing that it can do that in my mind. And so it knows how to get into a lot of different habitats. All right, I'm going to go on to cutleaf blackberry. So cutleaf blackberry is another invasive blackberry species, another invasive rubus. And this one looks somewhat similar in many ways to the Himalayan blackberry, but in comparison to all of the other rubus species that we're going to see today, it's got the most distinct leaves. So as you can see, it's got the leaves that kind of look like they've got cuts through them, hence the name. They'll still have those five lobed leaves. So on this image here with the leaves on the right hand side that you can see, this is actually considered one leaf. And this is the same for the Himalayan blackberry. And so each portion of this leaf is actually called a leaflet. So this leaf has 5 leaflets, and each of the leaflets have cuts into them. And so that's, as I say, where the cutleaf blackberry comes from. The flowers look quite similar. However, if we take a look, I'm going to jump back to the Himalayan blackberry really quickly, and you can take a look at the flower there. You can see that the petals themselves are quite a bit bigger, whereas on the cutleaf blackberry, they're actually almost cut. They look like they've been sliced down so that they're quite small. The stalks are pretty similar. They've also got the ridge stems, and the stalks can also reroot. The thorns on the evergreen blackberry on the cutleaf blackberry, and I've said evergreen blackberry, and that's actually another name for this one. I'm going to try and call it cutleaf just so I don't confuse everybody with the different names. With this one, the thorns are very curved, and so it's one of my least favorite rubus species to remove, because when you pick it up and you try and pick up a pile of it and move it somewhere, it just wraps around your legs, and it's quite a frustrating plant to remove. So sometimes Himalayan blackberry is a bit fun to take out, but cutleaf blackberry is not my favorite one to remove. Yeah. Yeah, and the fruit looks very similar to the Himalayan blackberry as well. And both are edible, which I suspect that most people here probably have eaten a blackberry in the past. And it's one of the main reasons why they're here, actually, is because they're quite tasty. All right, so I wanted to get into our native blackberry species. So this is trailing blackberry, and sometimes this one's called Pacific blackberry. And if you've ever seen Himalayan blackberry grow, so that's the invasive species, you've probably seen it grow in an enormous berm. So as we were saying, it grows quite large. Whereas the trailing blackberry really grows along the ground, and the trailing is really a good name for it. Often we find that when we find invasive plants that really take over the the trailing blackberry habitat, it'll be English ivy. So English ivy tends to be the main thing that actually is a problem for this species. So this one's actually interesting in comparison. There's male and female flowers on separate plants for this one. I couldn't tell you actually exactly what that looks like and how different it looks, but they've got the similar leaf and the similar petal shape and color. The stalks, as I say, are sprawling. They tend to go along the ground rather than vertically. They're not particularly strong, and so they're more of a vine than they are a strong stalk. Some of them can root at the tip with the stalks themselves, and the thorns tend to be slightly curved. The thorns on the trailing blackberry also are not typically as strong and robust as what you would find on the Himalayan blackberry. Yeah, so it's a very different feel to it. Oops. Keep on clicking by mistake. It's such an automatic thing. The leaves, this is an important piece when we're talking about it, and we'll see this when we do our comparison later on. They've got 3 leaves, and so this is quite different from the Himalayan blackberry, as well as the evergreen or the cutleaf blackberry. And later on, we'll see when we look at the salmonberry that this is what confuses people with the salmonberry, actually, because it looks very similar to that one. It also has berries, and the berries look very similar to the other berries. Apparently these ones taste really good and maybe are even better than Himalayan blackberry, but they don't seem to produce a whole ton of them, so you don't see them very often. And if you're in a park, they're also growing on the ground, so if you're anywhere where dogs walk, I probably wouldn't recommend eating these blackberries. Okay. So I'm going to go on to salmonberry. This is another native species here. Salmonberry also has 3 leaves. So I find that in terms of the leaves, they look very, very similar to the trailing blackberry. And so they can be a little hard to identify there. The flowers are a very different color though. The flowers have this beautiful, beautiful pink, almost fuchsia color. And the berries themselves are sort of salmon egg colored. So they've got that salmon orangey type color. Very, very pretty. Now, with this one, salmonberry can have thorns, but it doesn't always have thorns. And it actually often has more of a bark than a lot of these other species do. Most of them don't really feel like they've got much of a bark, but the salmonberry does. And I'm going to go into the details of the leaves once we get into the comparison part. So I'll leave that one there. And the last one I want to talk really quickly about is thimbleberry. So this is a species that most people would say, or many people that I've met have said that this has got the best flavor for berries. They taste really good, but if you take a look at the photo of the berry on the bottom, you can see it's actually quite a shallow cup. So instead of the blackberries that typically hold on to the base of the berry quite deep, the thimbleberry is quite shallow, and so they fall off really quickly. And so it's hard to actually find thimbleberries that are actually still on the berry, which may be part of the reason why it's harder to find the thimbleberry berry to eat. These ones are the most different from the other species. Instead of having leaflets, they've got one big leaf, and it's sort of maple leaf shaped. Now, one of the other pieces is that the leaf itself is kind of fuzzy. It's actually sort of soft. And so if you take it between your fingers and rub it around, then you'll feel that fuzziness. And it doesn't have any thorns on it at all. And one of the ways that I like to remember this one is that if you ever got stuck in the woods and you didn't have toilet paper, thimbleberry tends to make good toilet paper. And part of the reason for that is because there's no thorns on it at all. So you wouldn't want to use any of the blackberries, but thimbleberry can be a good option. Okay. So I'm going to go into some visual comparisons, but before I do that, have there been any questions that have come up as I've been going through? No? Okay. All right. So I want to go into the leaf comparison. So when we're taking a look at the leaves, I'm just going to put this one up here for a moment for everyone to take a look at. You can see those comparisons of the number of leaves the number of leaflets per leaf. We've got the two invasive blackberries on the top. They both have five leaflets per leaf. And then the two native species that have the leaflets, the salmonberry and trailing blackberry, have got 3 leaflets per leaf. And then as I say, the thimbleberry looks very, very different in comparison. The underside of the leaf. Now this one is actually an interesting one that I didn't realize until I started doing this comparison, is that the blackberry species all have thorns on the underside of the leaf. So I've got some close-ups to show you what that means. So for the cutleaf blackberry, you can see it's got thorns. The Himalayan blackberry also has thorns on the underside of the leaf. The salmonberry does not have thorns on the underside of the leaf, whereas the trailing blackberry, the native blackberry, does, and the thimbleberry does not. So this is a really good way, particularly with the salmonberry and the trailing blackberry, if you're trying to figure out which one is which, and maybe you've just got the leaves there. If you flip them over, then the trailing blackberry will have thorns on the back and the salmonberry will not. So one of the ways that people say to tell whether or not it's a blackberry is if you take your hand and you rub the leaf, if it bites you, it's blackberry. Now, of course, that's not a particularly good way to figure it out, but it's at least a way to explain it. All right, I want to take a look at the stems really quick. So this is where I want to show you what I mean by ridged. So this is another way to identify actually the invasive versus the native species. So when we look at cutleaf blackberry, that's one of the invasive species. And I've got some cross sections here. You can see that the cutleaf blackberry has a ridged stem. So when we look at that cross section, you can see that it's got sort of 5 points along it, and each of those points is a ridge that goes all the way along the stem. And you'll see the same thing when we look at the Himalayan blackberry. I think the photo for the Himalayan blackberry shows that the best, how much of a ridge there is. So when you're looking at the stem itself, you can really tell those ridges. And so when we're looking for an invasive species, we're looking for those ridges as one of our identifiers. When we're looking at salmonberry, you can see that that's a nice circle. That the cross section is circular. There's no ridges on the salmonberry. And that is the same for the trailing blackberry. Unfortunately, I didn't actually have a photo of the cross section for this one. And the thimbleberry as well is round. So the 2 invasive rubus species have got ridge stems, and the 3 native rubus species do not have ridges. All right. I wanted to do a really quick comparison of salmonberry and trailing blackberry. These 2 are the ones that get mistaken for one another sometimes. So we can take a look at the leaves. Just in general, very hard to tell. When we look at the underside of the leaf, it's smooth for the salmonberry, as we said earlier, and for the trailing blackberry, it has thorns on the underside of the leaf. And then for the stem itself, the salmonberry can have thorns on the stem, and the trailing blackberry will have thorns on the stem. The salmonberry looks like it's got a bit of a bark on it, whereas the trailing blackberry doesn't have a bark and it's almost got this frosted look to it. Which is kind of an interesting thing that's quite specific to the trailing blackberry that we don't always see in other species. And in this photo, we can see that what I call the toothpaste green color, and sometimes it'll be purple instead. So it can kind of be a purplish color or this green color. But the frosted look is something you'll see in the trailing blackberry. All right, wanted to talk through the different blackberry species as well. So when we're comparing, trying to figure out if we're looking at a native blackberry or an invasive blackberry, we've got the different number of leaflets, which is a big part of it. So the trailing blackberry has 3 leaflets and it's only going to have 3, so it won't have more. The cutleaf blackberry has 5 leaflets within the leaf, and the Himalayan blackberry has 5 leaflets. But as I mentioned before, when you've got the stems that have berries on them, they'll actually have 3. And so that can get a little bit confusing. Typically with trailing blackberry, we consider the leaves egg-shaped and pointed. And then if we're comparing that to the Himalayan blackberry, they typically are considered round. So that can be one of the ways to help identify them. As we looked at, the ridge stem can actually be really important, really helpful for telling one from another. Both of the invasive blackberries have got ridges, and the native blackberry does not have ridges. And all of them have prickles on the back of the leaf. So that'll be a way to compare it to the other native rubus species. And then between the Himalayan blackberry and the cutleaf blackberry, because of the leaf shape, that's really the main identifier for telling one from another. And so when you see cutleaf blackberry, I mean, even in the photos here, it's a very distinct leaf. And so it's really quite different from these other native species and the Himalayan blackberry. Right. So those are our rubus species. Those are the ones that we've got in the region. Now that I've gone through all that, I've got 2 questions. One, did anyone have any questions throughout that? And the second one is, did anyone want to go back and look at any of the comparisons that I put up there?
Do all of these grow or stay green throughout the whole year? Or do any of them kind of die off during winter?
That's a really good question. So when we're looking at these ones, the Himalayan blackberry and the evergreen blackberry will stay green all year long. The salmonberry and the thimbleberry both go dormant during the winter. And so often when we're doing removal, it's not uncommon for us to come across a big patch of brown sticks, and we'll have a lot of people who want to go in and just take out the sticks and just clear up the area, but it's actually most often salmonberry, and the salmonberry just goes dormant. It loses its leaves, but then as soon as the spring comes back and it starts getting a little bit warmer, it just blooms again. A while back I was chatting with someone who was saying that in the forests in Vancouver, because we've had logging done, and most of our forests are only about 150 years old, it's quite likely that the salmonberry that's in the forest may be the oldest living being within the forest, because they continue to grow through the root. The root will just continue and build new stalks, and may be continuing for hundreds of years. And so it does go dormant, but it is still alive. So that one's quite a cool one. Yeah. And then, it's actually a very good question about the trailing blackberry. I think that I've seen it during the winter, but I'm not positive that one stays green, but I wouldn't be surprised if it does. Yeah, that's a good question. Were there any slides there that anyone wanted to go back and look at?
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if I missed this, but I think you mentioned that blackberries like growing in disturbed soil.
Mm-hmm.
Why is that? And would they grow in regular soil?
That's a good question. So my understanding is the main reason that these plants want to grow in disturbed soil is because it's a space where their seeds can be dropped. And so quite often in areas where there's disturbed soil, the plants will be able to come in and the seeds will be able to go onto the ground. So in an area where it's disturbed, usually the soil itself has been broken up and it's loose and it's open. And so as much as we get in a lot of invasive plants that will use that space, there's also often a lot of native species that will use that space too. The main issue is that the invasive species are better at growing into that space quickly and taking over before the native plants can actually get in there. And then there are some cases where the area that's disturbed maybe has less nutrients, and a lot of these invasive plants can actually grow with fewer nutrients. And so it may not be a place where it's an ideal situation for it to grow, but it's one of the only plants that can actually grow in that area. And so that can be a reason why. Yeah, that's a really good question. Right. Any other questions before I move on?
Do you know where the evergreen blackberry came from?
Oh boy, that's a very good question. I'm going to go back to that first slide really quick and see if I had it on here. And if I don't have that one, oh, okay, there's got to be a better way for me to go through this. Okay. Let's see in here. I don't have it on here. That's a very good question. I'm going to have to take a look at that one. But on a similar question, I'll talk really quickly about Himalayan blackberry and where it comes from. So we call it Himalayan blackberry because the understanding for a long time was that it came from the Himalayan region. And it turns out that it's actually most likely Armenian. And so there's been a change where Himalayan blackberry used to be called Rubus discolor, and now the Latin name has been changed to Rubus armenicus because there's such strong evidence that it actually came from Armenia and not from the Himalayan region. And so this has been a really recent change, and it's only, I've only started changing this in my documentation this past year. So there's often more information coming about where these things come from. And Himalayan blackberry was actually brought into this region as a crop. So it was brought in so that it could be grown down in Oregon actually. And it was only brought in the late 1800s. So since then, it's been here for maybe a little over 100 years, and it's spread from Oregon up through this region here. Yeah. So I didn't answer your question specifically, but I gave you other information, so I hope that's good.
That was my next question, and it's
Okay.
interesting to hear that it was brought in as a crop. That's really cool.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And it's not uncommon that that's the case. We've got a number of invasive species that have been brought in as a crop or as an ornamental to go into a garden. In some cases, you might see something called Scotch broom that grows along the sides of highways. And I found out relatively recently that it was actually planted on purpose early on in building highways out here to strengthen the slopes along the sides of highways. So it was brought in quite likely by people who potentially did that kind of building in Scotland or in other parts of Europe where it would be native to, and then working with the knowledge that they had, they used the species that they knew were good to sit on the sides of highways. And so that may very well be a reason why it was brought in. Yeah. Awesome. Okay, I'm going to jump into my next identification here, and then we can have a little bit of time at the end for questions as much as we've got. Yeah, so I wanted to talk a little bit about English holly and Oregon grape. So these are two species that are I didn't actually know how to identify one from another until about 5 years ago. They look very, very similar. So English holly is an invasive plant. It's come over here from Europe, and it grows incredibly well out here. It uses a lot of water, and with our changing water regimes in this region due to climate change, there's some evidence that it may change the way that our ecosystems look in a very short period of time. It may have the ability to actually change how our forests look in this region. So it's quite a concern for this area. And then we do have a native species that looks really quite similar. So I'm going to go through them. So Oregon grape, you can see on the top, it can be shiny or it can be dull. So there's actually two types of Oregon grape, the shiny one or the tall one, as well as the dull one, which is quite small. It's always an interesting one. With the shiny one, I find that one's the one that compares the most to English holly. They're really quite tall, and so they can look a little bit like the English holly, which can eventually, the English holly can look like a tree in the end. One of the interesting ones on this one, I'm gonna tell this story quickly because I'm running out of time, but for the Oregon grape, the shiny Oregon grape is called Mahonia aquifolium, and the English holly is Ilex aquifolia. And the aqua, I had learned a while back that it had to do with water, and that meant the shiny leaf. But it turns out that I was wrong, and it actually has to do with aquiline, which refers to the shape of an eagle's beak, which is curved. And so if you take a look at both the shiny Oregon grape and the English holly, they have curved thorns that are aquiline. So that's where the name aquiline comes from, or the Latin names come from, which I thought was very cool. I quite like that one. The key piece when we're identifying Oregon grape and English holly is what we call the leaf orientation. So with the Oregon grape, the leaf orientation is opposite. So that means that from every node, 2 leaves come out of each node. And so there's leaves directly across from one another. Whereas with the English holly, they're alternate, which means that from each node, there's only 1 leaf that comes out. So the difference between this is alternate, imagine there's a stem in between. This is alternate, and this is opposite. So English holly is alternate, and Oregon grape is opposite. So that's one of the key pieces for identifying one from another. And the fruit and flowers can be a good identification. However, they're not always visible. And for English holly, only the female trees will have the berries, and so it's not always a great identifier because the male trees will just have the leaves. And then for the Oregon grape, they're called Oregon grape because of the way that their berries grow. They grow in these clusters that kind of look like grapes. So the key thing, again, with the Oregon grape versus the English holly really has to do with how the leaves are oriented. So opposite versus alternate. Okay. Now, I do have a few slides on knotweed and hogweed. And so maybe I'll do a really quick look through them. But as I say, I'm going to send out this information, so you're welcome to look more into the details of those. But I do want to save a little bit of time for us to chat briefly at the end. So knotweeds are an invasive plant in this region. They're one of the few provincially regulated plants. The other one is hogweed. So knotweed is actually, it's not a dangerous plant for humans. It's actually edible. Some parts of it are, but it's very damaging to the ecosystems. It comes in and it can grow incredibly quickly and often will grow on stream sides. And one of the only ways really to deal with this one is through chemical treatment, so herbicide. And if it's on a stream edge, you can't actually use herbicides on stream edges. And so it can be a very difficult plant to manage. So it's really important with knotweeds to make sure that you're identifying it early and dealing with the infestations before they become enormous. Sometimes there are some ways where you can do some manual removal, but this is something that no matter what, if you're ever running into knotweed, which we do find in the region for sure, quite a bit actually, you need to make sure that you're working with a professional for how to do this removal and the best way to go forward with it. It's a nasty one, and it's one of those plants that actually will grow on stream sides, and the roots will grow out into the stream, and then the stream eventually will break the root off, and it'll float downstream, catch onto something else, and then regrow as a whole new plant. So it's really, really good at growing, and will find a way. So it's definitely something you have to be careful about when you're working with it. And then I'll go really briefly again into giant hogweed. This is an invasive plant in this region, and is also very, it's a dangerous plant too for humans. It's one that you have to be careful of. It's not something that you're actually going to miss though. It's quite a large plant. And so actually I've got this photo in the middle. I put this one in here as sort of an example of what you shouldn't do. Please, if you think you may have found giant hogweed, don't stand underneath it. Giant hogweed has got, the sap is what's called phototoxic, which means that it's activated by sunlight and it'll actually burn your skin, and in some cases can cause third-degree burns. So this is a plant that is incredibly, it's something that you need to be really careful about if you do find it. And again, this is something that if you think you've found this on a site that you're working on, make sure that you're talking to a professional. And I can tell you now that you won't be the ones removing it. Even at SPES, we don't remove it. We bring in professionals who do the removal for this one. We do have some native plants that look somewhat similar, and so it's always best to be safe rather than sorry, and ask a professional to come in. One of the other issues with this one, with the phototoxicity, is that it can cause burns when you get the sap on your skin, but it'll actually continue to be a problem for years. And so people will find that the areas that have got sap on them for 15 years will continually burn in sunlight. And it won't necessarily be to the same degree, but it'll still hurt. And so this is a plant that is just one to be aware of, and just one to know about. I wouldn't be too concerned about it on a day-to-day basis, but if you're working in a site that potentially has hogweed, I highly recommend making sure that you've got someone who knows hogweed, who can just come in and confirm whether or not that is what it is. There we go. So now that I've finished on a very scary note, I want to open up to having a quick conversation for the last few minutes. If anyone has any questions, I'll let this be a time for you all to share. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that we can all see each other. All right. So as we're sitting here, does anyone have any particular questions?
I had a quick question about, I think you mentioned that the English ivy takes over the trailing blackberry. Does also the Himalayan take over the trailing, or are those ones less competitors?
The Himalayan blackberry could very well take over the trailing blackberry sites. The main reason I think that we typically find English ivy being the one that takes over the habitat is because of the trailing blackberry usually grows further into the forest, and the Himalayan blackberry usually doesn't get that far into the forest because it needs more sunlight than that can provide, and so that would probably be the main reason that the ivy would be the main concern for it. But yes, I would say that the Himalayan blackberry can absolutely grow into some portions of the habitat.
I think we have another question from the Fedders asking, where do you find hogweed? Where have you found hogweed?
Okay, so we've had it in Stanley Park in a few different spots, and I think we've had about 6 different sites where we found it. I previously worked up in North Vancouver in Lynn Canyon, and there were a few sites where we knew that it was, and when I worked up there, I worked with kids programming where we did summer camps, and so there were certain areas where we just wouldn't go to just because the risk was too high. So across the region there is giant hogweed. It tends to grow in more open sunny spots, so you won't really find it in the middle of the forest typically, but yeah, so it's an interesting one. In the link that I've got in the presentation that I'll make sure that everyone has an opportunity to grab, there's more detail on the specific habitat that it'll grow into. Yeah.
I had a couple of questions. I was wondering if holly or Oregon great berries were edible.
Ooh, that's a really good question. I'm gonna say I think they are, but until I've confirmed, don't eat them. There are a number of berries out here that are edible, but can be they call them poisonous, but usually you'd have to eat handfuls of it for it to be a real problem. And a lot of them in large quantities will have laxative effects, which essentially means it makes you need to go to the bathroom. And I'm not positive about whether or not Oregon grape has that effect, but I believe it is edible.
Yeah, Oregon grape is edible. It's
Okay.
very sour and has a small seed in the middle, and it kind of sucks, but it is
Okay.
edible.
Good. Thank you for doing the background research.
I was also wondering where hogweed came from.
Ooh, that's a really good question, and I'm actually not positive. That'll be something that'll actually be in the link that's in the presentation there. But very good question. Part of me, I have a memory in the back of my mind that's telling me that it came from parts of Asia. That being said, almost every plant that we have on our list is put under the term of coming from Eurasia, which is Europe and Asia, which is an enormous amount of space. And so it can be really hard to say where exactly it came from. So that's a very good question. Okay. Oh, got a visitor in behind me. It's time to feed the dog. All right. So before we finish up today, are there any other last minute questions that anyone wants to ask?
Is your dog wearing a hat?
That one was actually my sister.
Yeah.
Yeah. But you know, my dog, she wears a lot of sweaters. I didn't think I was going to be a sweater dog person, but she's always cold, so she wears a lot of sweaters. Yeah.
One more question. I was wondering if I had this one early on, but I forgot to ask. You know, when you were talking about the weaving of the English ivy, like I was wondering if there are any cases where you put the weaving back into the environment and it's actually taken root and regrown more invasive species.
I think I missed a little bit of the last bit of the question, but just to clarify, are you wondering about having some of the plants being put back into the ecosystem, native plants or invasive plants that you're wondering about?
Oh, I think earlier you were talking about the English ivy that was being woven.
Oh yes, yeah, good question. So with that process, when we're putting those invasive plants back in, we put them through, we dried them first. So with English ivy in particular, you can, as long as you dry it completely before you put it back into the ecosystem, then it won't regrow. Himalayan blackberry can in some cases regrow. And so if we're putting, if we're piling up Himalayan blackberry, if we put it into a gigantic pile, usually it'll eventually die. But if we put Himalayan blackberry canes onto the ground, it can actually reroot from that, which is just amazing that it can do it. I'm always in awe of these invasive plants, and even though they're, you know, not good for the ecosystem, they're pretty amazing in what they can do. And so when we do that with bringing some of these invasive plants back into the ecosystem for restoration purposes, there are often things we need to do first, like drying them in the case of English ivy. Yeah, that's a great question. Awesome. Okay. Well, I'm thinking, what do you think? Is that everyone's questions for now, or does anyone have anything pressing?
Are there any last minute questions?
If anyone does come up with any questions later on that you want to ask, please feel free to pass them on to Erin, and I'm more than happy to answer them later. So if something comes to you later, feel free to reach out.
Awesome. So I just want to say thank you to everyone for being here, and a special thanks to Jeanine for sharing your time and your expertise. Yeah, if we can give you a round of applause, a silent one, I guess.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah, it's been wonderful. I know that I really enjoy this process of becoming more familiar with invasives and like differentiating them. So yeah, it's been great. And also I want to kind of let everyone know that there's an opportunity to work with Jeanine through a volunteering event this Saturday afternoon. So if you're interested, Rafa and I went there the other weekend, and it's a beautiful spot, and we'll be doing some planting. So yeah.
Yeah, and if you're interested in volunteering for us, or you know anybody who's interested in volunteering for us, we have a couple more spaces, I believe. And so you can go onto our website as well as on our Instagram, and the registration links are on there. You just have to register online, and we can see you on Saturday. It'll be a good time.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for
Great.
being here.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Right.
Thank
Have a good night, everybody.
you.
Absolutely.
Thank you.